We can start, Saritaji. We are live.
Thank you. Namaste. Sarita Rahul. I'm part of FISI team. FISI is a non-profit international NGO and is a formidable voice for all India-related matters in the UK. Friends of India Society International was established in the UK in 1976 during the state of emergency in India that had led to suspension of democracy, curbing many fundamental rights of people and institutions in India. Its ethos and objective is to promote India in the UK. It achieves that by highlighting India's achievements in various fields such as culture, sports, economics, and sciences. FISI achieves this by developing relationship with several diaspora organizations in the UK and providing them a platform to come together. FISI also achieves its objective by engaging in seva for the diaspora when required. Like during COVID, FISI had joined hands with Indian National Students Association and Seva UK to help many distressed Indian students and other Indian nationals visiting UK. Similarly, FISI team also volunteered during the Ukraine crisis with SEMA International to provide a helpline for students as they made their way to the western borders of Ukraine. Another aim of FISI is to provide a forum to discuss various issues related to India, rendering a better understanding of the concerned topic. In fact, today's conversation is one such attempt where FISI is enabling discussion on the challenges faced by the Indic civilization in the upheaval period from 1740 to 1924 and present day. To shed more light on this discussion, we are very fortunate to have Sai Deepak with us today, who is the author of best-selling book, India, that is Bharat, the first book of comprehensive trilogy, and India, Bharat and Pakistan, Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution, the second book of Bharat trilogy, which takes the discussion forward. Syed Deepak is an engineer turned litigator, practicing as an arguing counsel primarily before the Supreme Court of India and the High Court of Delhi. A mechanical engineer from Anna University, Sai graduated with bachelor's degree in law from IIT Kharagpur's law in 2019 and has carved a niche for himself as a litigator in civil, commercial, and constitutional matters. He has been part of several landmark cases, such as those related to Shabarimala Ayyappa Temple, the Sri Padmanabha Swami Temple, and Basmati geographical indications. In 2019, Sai was presented the Young Alumni Achievers Award by his alma mater, IIT Kharagpur. Apart from delivering lectures on constitution issues, he writes prolifically for leading newspapers and magazines. To enable today's discussion with Sai Deepak ji, we have Dr. Vijay Rana ji, journalist, a historian, and filmmaker. Having done his doctorate in philosophy, Vijay Rana ji joined BBC Hindi service in London and rose to become its radio editor. In his 3 decades long journalistic career, Vijay Rana ji has interviewed many senior Indian leaders like Morarji Desai, Charan Singh, Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji, Narendra Modi ji when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. He has contributed to India Today, The Times, BBC Online, and several Hindi newspapers, and also writes for Indian Express. He has been filming the city of Varanasi for the last 4 years. He has recently also produced a documentary called Banaras, the story of India's sacred city. With this small introduction of Sai Deepak ji and Vijay Rana ji, I will hand over to Vijay Rana ji to continue this discussion further. Vijay Rana ji, over to you.
Thank you, Sarita. Sai Deepak, what a pleasure. Congratulations on your recent publication, India, Bharat and Pakistan, the constitutional journey of a sandwich civilization. My own impression is that this is a remarkable work, painstakingly researched. What impressed me most was the structure of each chapter. I noticed three very important aspects of Sai Deepak's writing style. In the beginning of the chapter, in one paragraph, he informs his readers about the primary sources of the story that he's going to narrate in that chapter. This is very useful for future researchers who want to build upon his narrative. Secondly, most of the important speeches, correspondences, and documents are quoted in great detail. What happens is that most authors abridge these vital resources and try to impose their own viewpoint on their readers. However, Sai Deepak lets you read those documents and speeches and allows you to make your own conclusions. It will really help future historians, researchers, and writers who can quote and cite these very important facts. And finally, at the end of almost every chapter, he has summarized the issues that he has raised there and presented the conclusion in neat bullet points. And that's real knowledge sharing and very useful to readers like me. So thank you, Sai Deepak.
Thank you, sir.
Before we go into India, Bharat and Pakistan, your recent publication, The Constitutional Journey of a Sandwich Civilization, let me have a clarification for my audiences. Your first book was also titled as India, that is Bharat. What, according to you, differentiates India and Bharat?
So, some people think that this distinction between India and Bharat is non-existent and it is merely, at best, semantic jugglery and has no real meaning. But I do believe that there is real meaning to be lent to both these words and both these names, so to speak. And that much is very, very clear from the discussion before the Constituent Assembly on the question of Article 1 itself, on the issue of naming itself. The amount of controversy that the use of Bharat generated in the Constituent Assembly, one would have assumed that after achieving independence, or at least the assumed notion of independence, we'd have been much more comfortable reclaiming this name Bharat. But the sheer number of hours spent, at least 2 days were spent on it. And surprisingly, Dr. Ambedkar needed a fair bit of convincing to accommodate Bharat alongside India, because he was not particularly comfortable leaving aside India or junking India altogether. So clearly, there are two connotations in people's headspaces as far as these two names are concerned. Now, my own limited take on this, as a student of constitutional law and an untrained student of history, is that India happens to be perhaps the westernized notion of Bharat, which both westernized Indians and Westerners are comfortable residing in. Bharat happens to be the name that rooted Bharatiyas are much more comfortable associating themselves with. And since it also happens to be a name that finds significant mention as a geographical entity, as a cultural entity, and as a civilizational entity as far as our scriptures are concerned, Bharat, according to me, has greater resonance in this quest for decolonization that people like me have embarked upon. So I see India and Bharat as two different parallel universes in which people of this country reside, and that includes members of the diaspora, not just the citizens of this country. So the hyphenated relationship between India and Bharat is perhaps the story of the multiple personality or the dual conscious disorder that Bharat currently suffers from. And I bring out this particular idea even better, even if I say so myself, by using India, Bharat and Pakistan as the title, as opposed to merely India and Pakistan or Bharat and Pakistan. And the conscious use of Bharat between India and Pakistan represents the sandwiched nature of the native civilizational identity. So that's been my position so far. And my reading of history, at least until 1924, vindicates this particular position that it seems as if the native rooted Bharatiya voice has found itself stuck between westernized native and, of course, the colonizers. So that's the position, sir.
That's quite interesting and perhaps strange as well that it took for somebody almost 75 years to assert that India is also called as Bharat. Otherwise, everybody talks about it, India here, and even now, even in the villages, people say India mein ye ho raha, India mein ye ho raha.
Correct.
Okay, let's go ahead. Let's into your book now. Until now, the story of Muslim separatism in India used to begin with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and end up with Muhammad Ali Jinnah. But you have taken the story to its roots. As you write, the inherent separate tendency of Middle Eastern consciousness started with Syed Ahmad Sarhindi. And this was quite surprising for me because he lived in Akbar's time and he was quite critical of Akbar's Deen-e-Ilahi and all those things. Right. And you further bring out two prominent personalities, Shah Waliullah Dehlvi, 18th century, and Ahmad Shah Barelvi, 18th, 19th century. So, could you further elaborate on this, how this whole process started with these two guys?
So, a clarification is perhaps important from my end. I do believe that the two-nation theory is at the heart of the faith system that they subscribe to. And therefore, the division of the world between believers, namely Mu'mins, and infidels, namely Kafirs, is the Quranic basis for the two-nation theory. This much is something that Syed Shabir Usmani, one of the Quranic justifiers of the state of Pakistan, and one of the founders of Jamia Millia Islamia specifically said that Pakistan is perhaps the first state to be set up on the basis of the distinction between the Mu'mins and the unbelievers or the infidels. So the root cause analysis would take us directly to Quran. But the reason why I start from the mid-18th century is because that's the most proximal cause where the two-nation theory is given a very clear doctrinal shape by Shah Waliullah Dehlvi. The reason why I don't focus too much on Sarhindi, but certainly introduce him, is because during his period, since the Mughal Parcham, so to speak, and consequently the Islamic flag was flying high, there was no necessity for them to assert the two-nation theory because for all practical purposes, we were living in an Islamic state. Okay, Bharat had become an Islamic state under the Mughals. Notwithstanding the exaggerated tales of secularism and pluralism that we are constantly fed. And the two-nation theory's direct assertion becomes very, very relevant after the decline of the Mughal Empire because Muslim intellectuals can feel state power slipping away from their hands. And therefore, Shah Waliullah Dehlvi, alongside another contemporary, which is Abdul Wahab, comes out with a very clear doctrinal position in terms of how this must translate to political realities, both as far as Bharat is concerned and the rest of the world. In fact, he was among the first people to suggest that in order for an Islamic revival in terms of the political power, so to speak, the beginning must be made in Bharat, because Bharat was effectively seen as the single biggest possession in the hands of Muslims, which could lead to global domination because Bharat had both the human resources as well as the capital resources needed to fund Islamic expansionism. So he wanted the beginnings of an Islamic caliphate, starting with Bharat as the foundation stone for that particular caliphate. So therefore, his analysis becomes very, very crucial. Second, he effectively presented the clear doctrinal exposition of his position, which was then implemented by the creation of a massive all-India network by Syed Shahid Barelvi across the country. So according to me, these three people were ideological and intellectual predecessors of Syed Ahmad Khan. And most importantly, the seminary in which Shah Waliullah Dehlvi taught which was established by his father, which is Madrasa Rahimia, happened to be the single biggest institution to produce the founders of at least 6 Islamic revival movements, which I show at the end of the first chapter of the second book. So clearly, it's not just a question of people agreeing with each other across time spans, but it is evident that they are products of a single institution. And therefore, the thought continuum is natural and obvious. It's not for us to actually try and make leaps of logic and leaps of facts here. That's why I had to show what is the timeline and how is it that each of these people come out of the very same institution and then go on to establish multiple institutions across the country, whether it's the LA Hadith movement, the Deoband movement, even for that matter, the Ahmadiyya movement and the Barelvi movement. Each of these movements and the Aligarh movement are ideological and religious successors of the Dehlavi movement. So Pakistan, according to me, is the culmination of the Dehlavite worldview.
Exactly, and you have proved it so well and written it so extensively. But when we come to narration building, now look at how Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is described nowadays. He's called as a Muslim reformer, a philosopher, a modernist, an educationalist, and the father of Muslim Renaissance.
Right.
These are the terms in which our scholars present him. Now compare this with Savarkar, anti-Muslim, anti-British, right-winger, communalist, somebody who wanted to conduct his politics through violence and anti-Gandhi, that sort of thing. So what do you take on this? How this thing happened that somebody like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, despite his passion for the rule of Quran in India, in future India, ends up as a modernist and philosopher and educationalist?
I think the credit for this brilliant acrobatics goes to the historical, or let's say the history departments which were set up under Nehru post the 1950s. So here's my take on it, and hopefully once I'm done with the 4 books, I should be able to prove this better. Now, Nehru embarks on the land reform movement where he tries to abolish zamindari system, and then he is looking to secure constitutional protection for all his land reform positions. Now, among the people who vociferously and vehemently oppose Nehru's positions on most of these aspects are the communists of that particular period. There's a very popular judgment which most students of constitutional law, Indian constitutional law, would be familiar with. It's Romesh Thapar versus Union of India. And Romesh Thapar used to be a Marxist of the first order who used to write heavily, at the very least a communist, let me not call him Marxist or Leninist, a communist who used to oppose Nehru heavily. And Nehru would find articles being repeatedly published against his political overtures and his policy decisions. So this led to 2 outcomes. The first outcome was the first amendment to the Constitution was introduced by Nehru in consultation with Dr. Ambedkar, which led to greater curbs on free speech, by the way. And it is that first amendment which is currently under challenge before the Supreme Court. After 75 years, the first amendment is under challenge for the very first time before the Supreme Court. Okay. The second thing that he did was that all his land reform decisions were put as part of what is known as the 9th schedule of the Constitution, so that they are immune from constitutional challenge, any kind of constitutional challenge. So he did both these things. But by the time he was done with this particular exercise, I think he realized that if he did not find a way to massage and patronize the leftist ecosystem in this country, he was bound to have a very, let's say, a friction-based relationship with them. And so I think he decided to massage their egos by extending academic support and giving them the reins of the intellectual ecosystem of the country. It was under Nehru that I think a fantastic division of labor was arrived at, wherein the political space was ceded completely to the Congress in return for political patronage of the leftist ecosystem by the Congress, which means academia, media, history, pop culture, all of this and journalism would be completely given over to the left.
You were very clear.
No wonder today the Congress constantly finds support from the so-called leftist establishment, despite there being very clear ideological differences at the fundamental level. So, during that period, the manner in which history was created, not narrated, it was never presented in terms of facts. The style of writing
He
of
with
R.C.
high
Majumdar or
security
Jadunath Sarkar or
threats.
Radhakumar Mukherjee is the style of writing that I have tried to emulate as part of my books, which is quote the first source and the primary source as much as possible, without paraphrasing it in a manner that suits your ideological positions. I am not ideologically neutral. I have my very clear biases on my own positions. But at least with respect to facts, the attempt has been to present it as is where is. But under the Nehruvian Marxist establishment, which I have called the third wave of colonization by Indians themselves, of themselves, I think what has happened is history was put through such whitewashing and distortion that we are still trying to recover from the effects of it after 75 years. So much so that when facts are being presented, a lot of people are asking themselves, why wasn't this told to us before through school textbooks and curricula and history departments and whatnot? That is the extent of distortion that Bharatiya history has been subjected to by this coterie. So it was a very calculated move, and it's unfortunate that neither the goal was noble nor were the means noble. And the end result is, after 75 years, if the most vociferous voices which oppose the Bharatiya civilization are Bharatiyas themselves, I think the credit for that goes to the education system and the larger cultural establishment that was put together under the aegis of both the Nehruvian establishment and the Marxist establishment. I think we are suffering as a consequence of the collaboration between the two.
Let me tell you a little personal story about R.C. Majumdar. First of all, today's generation has effectively forgotten that these were the historians. I was looking for a job in 1975, starting my career. I appeared in an interview board for Indian Council of Historical Research. They were going to start this Towards Freedom project, which never happened and which swallowed a huge amount of money. So I applied for the job, and there were S. Gopal was sitting in the board, and R. S. Sharma, all the top historians, leftist historians. And they asked me, what have you studied? The main book you have studied. I said, The Age of Classic Imperialism, edited by R.C. Majumdar. And they were so upset about it. And after that, I was really made to feel unwelcome. And I didn't know, because at the time, I'm a young student, didn't understand the politics of history, which was just beginning in India.
Right.
So I came out very depressed out of that interview. But I'm glad that I was not selected for that project. Coming back to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan now, wasn't he really foresighted that as soon as the Congress party is established, he is very passionately going around the country telling Muslims not to join the Congress party, and he's calling Congress as a Hindu Congress and a Bengali Congress, and he's really scathing about Bengalis. So why couldn't Congress or other historians couldn't, and it's so obvious. Why didn't they write about this? This is what's surprising. He's still as kind of modernist and Renaissance man.
Yes, I think the founding DNA of the Congress itself was not particularly Hindu in nature. They were very clear about the fact that they were secular, even at the outset. Okay. Now, there is a decent chance that perhaps they felt that secularism was one of the values that propelled the West to its heights. And therefore, they felt that if we were to imbibe the values of the West, then we could take Bharat along the very same path of growth and development and progressivism. That seems to be the narrative that they have consumed lock, stock, and barrel. So in chapter 4, where I specifically deal with the founding of the Congress, so on and so forth, I have very clearly come to the conclusion on the basis of the material that the Congress never saw itself as a Hindu party. And it believed that it was the big church, pun intended, for all sorts of ideas. And therefore, they felt that since we don't see ourselves as a Hindu party, what problems could the Muslims have in terms of becoming part of the Congress so that a unified voice could be presented before the colonizer to seek dominion status and home rule? That was more or less their position. Now, it just so happens that all their bubbles were shattered by Syed Ahmad Khan, who before the founding of the Congress and even more so after the founding of the Congress, had become a sharper proponent of the two-nation theory. Most people assume that the founding of the Congress and its Hindu majority character was the reason for the generation of the two-nation theory by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. But the fact of the matter is, at least 2 decades before that, he had started pushing the two-nation theory in the political space. So much so that when parliamentary-style democracy was being considered for introduction in Bharat, he was among the first people to vociferously push back, saying this is bound to translate to a Hindu majority state power because they outnumber us 4:1. And therefore, that kind of conventional democracy is not going to work in this country because we, as former rulers of Hindustan who have lorded over Hindustan for 800 years, will be reduced to a secondary status, politically speaking, which was never going to be acceptable. The introduction of communal electorates takes place only in 1906 after the similar deputation. But he was already opposing a parliamentary style democracy at least 30 years before the introduction of communal electorates. Therefore, I would say that the foundations and the ideological justifications and religious justifications for communal electorates was laid by Syed Ahmad Khan during his lifetime. He passed away in 1898. So from 1857 to 1898, for close to 3 decades, this gentleman, or over 3 decades, this gentleman had laid the basis for it through his social movements, through his institutional building. And in his private correspondence, he makes it abundantly clear that the sole reason for his British loyalism is to ensure that the Hindu does not take back the state power from the British man. Now, when faced with this kind of clarity and razor sharp focus, I think the Congress stood no chance whatsoever in dealing with such a, let's say, such a mentality. Because you see, the Congress literally comes across as being all over the place. We are this, we are that, we are everything under the sun. Because their primary purpose was to ensure that there was no other voice in this country that represented Indians. So in their race to become perhaps the sole representative of all Bharatiyas, they were willing to accommodate everything under the sun. And even that accommodation was not acceptable to Syed Ahmad Khan and his intellectual successors, so to speak. So I would say, as a student of history, in terms of drawing a lesson for Indic civilizational survival, I have learned more from the intransigence of Syed Ahmad Khan and Jinnah than I have from the moderates in the Congress. And even within the Congress, if at all there is a faction that was equally intransigent and was clear about its purpose, I think it was the extremists and the revolutionaries. More than the revolutionaries, I'd say the extremists were clear because you see, even the revolutionaries to a significant extent set up a provisional government in Afghanistan at one point, okay, under Champakumaran and so on and so forth. The problem is that Afghanistan and the Emir of Afghanistan was constantly looking for ways to invade Bharat with the collaboration of a lot of people within Bharat, okay. So in that sense, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, Aurobindo Ghosh and Bipin Chandrapal, these were the saner voices which were clear about the reality of the two-nation theory and were urging the moderates in the Congress to give up their doe-eyed notion and dew-eyed notion as to how all of us are the same and how all of us constitute a single nation. That I don't think the moderates in the Congress were willing to accept. So I believe that one of the reasons that the Congress did not know how to respond to Syed Ahmad Khan and successive Muslim separatist movements is because of its notion that since Hindus were comfortable giving up their roots and giving up their sense of identity, they equally expected the Muslims of this country to give up their sense of identity, which the Muslims did not. And most importantly, Muslims were very clear that Western-style democracy in Bharat would mean that they would be reduced to a religious and a political minority, which was never going to be acceptable. So in hindsight, I think at the very least, communal electorates was the natural way forward. Whether partition could have been avoided or not, I'm still not in a position to answer that question.
Quite interesting. And then enters a third party. The British realize the importance of what is happening in the Muslim consciousness. And there are two very critical people who are sitting in the college which was set up by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. That was called as Anglo-Mohammedan, MAO college, Anglo College. That was a legal, which later became the legal university, and that becomes the center of Islamic separatism. Principal Theodore Back, who was almost drafting, resolutions of Muslim League. He was involved for them, and also William Arkbold, who was the successor of Back, and who, in fact, set up a meeting of Muslim League, first Muslim delegation with the Viceroy Minto in Shimla. So at this juncture, when Muslims have clearly worked out a path for future and Congress is, almost sunk into delusion, because Gokhale made the claim before 1909 Act that I have set up very important relationship with Secretary of State Morley, and he's all praise of him without realizing that they're going to play the real game, which will set the path for partition, road to partition. So tell me how the British, and particularly these two people, helped Muslim League against the Congress.
So before I answer the question, let me just also give you one factoid, which I've hinted in the book, which is when the Muslim League was being founded in December 1906, and that idea was being floated by Nawab Salimullah, and they had already made that proposal public. At the Congress session, they dismissed it as a joke. They dismissed the very serious proposal of a Muslim League as a joke which would never fructify into reality. This gives you a clear picture as to the delusional mentality of the Congress, which was absolutely clueless about the storm that was gathering. So that's one. Now, coming to the role played by the British principals of the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which later became the Aligarh Muslim University, two things. One, they proved to be the interlocutors between the state establishment and the Muslim establishment. And they proved to be fantastic advisors to the Muslim separatists in terms of teaching them how to navigate the colonial establishment, to the extent that drafting of deputations and representations was undertaken by them to a large extent. So that was one. Second, while it is assumed that British principals were effectively responsible for stoking Muslim nationalism, so there was a pre-existing divide. They would add fuel to that particular fire by constantly raking up issues such as how, imagine this, British principles of Aligarh would actually say that introduction of democracy was bad for Muslims of this country. They were making this argument. So while British parliamentarians sitting in London were mooting this particular proposal for introduction of Western style democracy in Bharat, British principals in Aligarh would say, no, this goes against the interests of Muslims, and that they would stand by Muslims in the event of a confrontation with the British establishment for protection of Muslim rights. That was the extent to which they were going about it. Two, Minto effectively inherited a state of affairs from Curzon, who was responsible for the partition of Bengal. Now, prior to the partition of Bengal, there was already a huge movement for the creation of a certain Muslim-dominated territory. That, coupled with administrative reasons, once Curzon granted them Eastern Bengal and Assam as a separate Muslim-dominated territory, so to speak, it proved to be a great breeding ground for all their political experiments. So they used that particular ground to see how much they could extract in terms of concessions from the British establishment. So much so that in terms of employment in the colonial establishment, they got the British to agree that even if there was a job which was vacant and a position that was vacant, and a Hindu was found to be better qualified for that over the Muslim, the Hindu would not be considered for that particular position. It would be the Muslim who would be given preference. This was the extent to which they managed to secure concessions from the British establishment. So therefore, from there, once they come to Minto, by that time, there is a clear normalization of Islamic exceptionalism, which is to say, we will be treated as separate, we will be treated as distinct, and we will be treated as special. All these three requirements were met. And therefore, once Minto and Morley come here, they are then faced with the question, okay, now how do we go about it from here, now that we've inherited a certain state of affairs from Curzon? Now, you can't immediately undo what Curzon did, because obviously there is a question of continuum of policy. Just like today, the BJP cannot undo everything that the Congress did, because as a government, you're expected to take forward certain policies, whether you like them or not. That's the same thing that Minto and Morley were going through after they succeeded in their respective positions from Curzon. Second, by that time, the Muslim establishment realizes that they had a few things to learn from the manner in which the Congress had organized itself as a fantastic political vehicle and which understood the way the British establishment worked. Now, from the Muslim perspective, the Congress was doing it for Hindu parties. But from the Congress perspective, they were not Hindu at all. Nevertheless, the Muslims realized that they needed a very clear political vehicle. Because you see, Syed Ahmad Khan dies in 1898. Aligarh was largely a social movement. It had not created a credible political channel or a credible political party, so to speak. So the discussion for a Muslim League starts. Simultaneously, they realize that it is time for them to start making representation and established contact with the British establishment directly at the topmost level possible. And then is when the principal archbold proves to be the bridge between the British establishment and the Aligarh establishment. And that similar deputation, according to me, which was 40 years prior to 1946, when Pakistan had become a reality, according to me, that was the clearest signal that if separate electorates did not find favor, they were willing to wage civil war. In 1906, that is 4 decades before the partition of undivided Bharat, they had already made it abundantly clear that if separate electorates was not accepted for Muslims, then they would revive the valor and the swordsmanship of their ancestors, was the clear statement made by the Muslims. So please note that while political maneuvering certainly played a role, and the British also realized that it made sense to cultivate the Muslims as counterweights to Hindu nationalism, or what they saw as Bengali nationalism. The difference between the Congress and the predecessors of the Muslim League was the Congress was completely averse to use of street power. The Congress actively dissuaded any kind of revolutionary activity because it did not want to be seen as a seditious organization whatsoever. So they would actively speak out against all revolutionaries and even extremists within the organization. Whereas the Muslim League was very, very comfortable constantly hinting at the use of street power when necessary. So therefore, I think 3 fantastic interests converged. One, the moderates in the Congress wanted to be completely rid of the extremists within the Congress by 1905. 2, the British establishment realized that the Congress was being pushed more and more in the direction of Purna Swaraj by the extremists within, and therefore they needed a counterweight to it. 3, Muslims had a problem with the British accommodation of the Congress, as well as the fact that the Congress was being gradually hijacked by the extremists. So all these 3 interests converged, and the convergence of that interest translated to a special treatment of Muslims by the British establishment to create a counterweight to the Congress. That's how I've effectively captured it, because none of these developments were single variable equations. There were multiple interests at different ends, each of which were being accommodated. I think the British played a fantastic game, but usually what happens in the popular narrative is that we conveniently look at it only from the British perspective and we say, no, it was only the divide and rule policy. Until then, there was this beautiful Hindu-Muslim unity that all of us were living in. I am trying to bust the myth. No, that's not the case. There was a 1,000-year fissure and a deep divide. The British understood the nature of that particular divide and they exploited it to the hilt. And there was no way, independent of the British exploitation of that particular divide, that Hindus and Muslims, at least in that particular period, could have continued to live as a single nation. That was never going to be a possibility.
Thanks. And for those who have joined us in the middle of this program, let me remind them that we are discussing with author J Sai Deepak his recent publication, India, Bharat and Pakistan, the constitutional journey of a sandwich civilization. Sai Deepak, let's bring in other gentleman who is a major player in this game of Hindus, Muslims, and the British. Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He enters politics in 1905 as secretary of, not Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, but as congressman, he joins in 1905. Right. In 1913, he joins the Muslim League and he's a member of both the parties till 1921. For 7 years, he's a congressman as well as a Muslim League. And we all know what Muslim League sessions used to be. They were virtually anti-Hindu venom in those sessions. So he's happy to join that band, as well as he's a secular, because our my historians still paint him as the secular Jinnah who was forced into communism by a religious Mahatma Gandhi.
Right.
Muhammad Ali Jinnah, I think one of the first greatest achievement was the Lucknow Pact, 1916. It was a pact between Congress Party and the Muslim League, in which both parties agreed. The second important principle of which led to the partition. The first one was separate electorate, which was granted to, which was given to India by the British. Now Jinnah comes in and he signs this pact with. On the Congress side, it was Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who was supposed to be the extremist, but here he comes out as the more moderate than even Gokhale. So this pact gave weightage to Muslims that even if you are 20%, we'll give you 40% seats. And what really is good about your book is that you have given a table. In fact, as a lecturer, I was always struggling how much seats were given to which state for the Muslims. So you give a very neat table which says that in United Province, the population of Muslim was, that was UP in those days, 14%, and they got 30% seats in any future arrangement. In Punjab, they were 55%, they got 50% seats. In Bombay, Muslims were 30%, 20%, and they got 33% seats. So this table was extremely useful to me, in fact, for my own study. Thank you very much indeed. So tell me about this, the significance of 1916 Hindu-Muslim Unity Pact, as most of our textbooks still describe them. In fact, later on, Muhammad Ali Jinnah says that that was the first admission by Congress Party of the division between Hindus and Muslims. And he used to wonder, you accepted the idea of Hindu-Muslim division in 1916. Why are you opposing it in 1946? So tell me about the significance of Lucknow Pact on the road to partition.
The Lucknow Pact is a significant departure from the British loyalist position of the Muslim League. And the reason why it is a significant departure and the reason why it was even necessitated was because of the First World War. Because they realized that the caliphate was under attack. And by that time, Turkey had joined the war. And therefore, they wanted a bargaining chip on the negotiation table with the British, which is to say, if you do not protect Turkey's interests, or if you go too much against it, then the crown jewel, which is Bharat, will be taken away from you, and we will support the Congress in this particular overture. And this much they make it clear in their own internal correspondence, that the primary reason that they joined the Home Rule movement or the Lucknow Pact or everything under the sun is to ensure that they put pressure on the British to back off from Turkey. That's one. Two, they also realize that without the support of the Congress, they would not have the negotiating power with the British, and therefore they had to achieve some kind of meeting ground or common ground with the Congress. Now, the Congress also realizes that in order for it to present its case as a single nation before the British, it would need the Muslim support. So there is a meeting of minds there that happens. Plus, if you look at the preceding events, I've also mentioned the Kanpur mosque incident as a prelude to the 1916 Lucknow Pact, which significantly alienated the Muslims of this country from the British, because a portion of the mosque in Kanpur was demolished by under orders of the commissioner of that particular point, whereas the adjoining temple was left free because of the involvement of Sri Madan Mohan Malviya. So the Muslim League effectively felt that despite us being in power, or let's say despite us being in politics for close to a decade, somehow the Congress is able to get things done better than us. And therefore, if we want to achieve a few of our goals, it makes a lot more sense for us to ally with the Congress. Now, since communal electorates had already become a reality for over a decade in 1906, by the time of the Lucknow Pact, all they wanted was further extraction of two more concessions from the Congress. One, that on the question of language, which is to say on the Hindi-Urdu controversy, primacy would be given to preservation of Urdu in certain places. And two, Hindus would never raise an issue which would have a bearing on Muslim religious interests, which means we would have to give up our demand for cow slaughter, our demand for ban on cow slaughter, which the Congress agreed to. The Congress effectively, as part of the Lucknow Pact, crystallized the position of what is known as communal veto. Any issue which would require concession of Muslim religious interest cannot be raised if there is a veto from the Muslim side. That is the biggest concession that was given by the Congress. Now, with all of this going, frankly speaking, who benefited from this entire negotiation? The Muslims managed to get a communal veto from the Congress. They managed to get a greater share of political representation from the table that you just read out. They also got the Congress to support them against the British for the khilafat movement, which had effectively started by them. Okay? And they were getting all this not from Gandhi. Gandhi was a nobody then in 1916. They were getting it from the so-called extremists. And who were the extremists? Annie Besant and Bal Gangadhar Tilak. By that time, 3 people had already been arrested and kept under detention. The Ali brothers and Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, all 3 of whom were constantly batting for the Islamic Caliphate, which is Turkey, and who were active proponents of jihad, and who were actively also conspiring with Germans for importation of weapons and whatnot into this country, so that there could be an internal uprising against the British in Bharat. Okay, so they were put under detention. Bal Gangadhar Tilak in his annual sessions is asking for the release of all these people. Annie Besant is asking for the release of all these people. In popular discourse these days, we are being told that Gandhi single-handedly was responsible for magnifying the importance of the Khilafat movement. But Gandhi inherited a Congress which had already accepted the importance of Khilafat movement, is a fact that most people don't know. Of course, he magnified it further as a second issue. But to give Khilafat mainstream presence and to also make it a specific issue which is discussed as part of every annual meeting, you pointed out that Jinnah enjoyed dual membership. I've shown the proceedings of the Muslim League where Gandhi, Annie Besant, Tilak would also be present, each of them agreeing with resolutions with respect to Khilafat, each of them agreeing with respect to resolutions on communal veto. That means, effectively, as far as the Hindu side is concerned, there was not one single person that they could fall back on for uncompromising representation of our interests. Those who were in a position to do so, like Sri Aurobindo, they had already been evicted from the Congress in 1907 after the Surat session. So 1906, 1916 are 2 major milestones to understand as to why the partition at some point was inevitable, because every negotiation and every concession from your end would result in greater negotiation and greater concession. In fact, 3 months before the Lucknow Pact was arrived at, the last 3 months were spent exclusively on increasing the vote share of the Muslims, because they said, sorry, there's been a riot in Bihar or in some other place, more Muslims have been killed. As compensation, we want more vote share. You see how the negotiation happens. So every riot, Hindus are held responsible for, and therefore it must translate to greater protection of Muslim interest by greater assurance with respect to communal veto and greater concession on vote share. This was the bargaining strategy. A lawyer will tell you, a practicing lawyer will tell you that there was a fantastic legal mind at work, which was extracting as much as possible from the negotiation. And I would say Jinnah was the brain behind this.
Exactly. You know, one of the sharpest lawyers in those days, as he was known as. You have already mentioned Khilafat movement. Let me tell you a little story. When I joined the BBC Hindi service in Bush House in the early 80s, I was doing an exercise. You know, we used to go to different language service and interview the head there. So I went to the Turkish service, so I'm interviewing this guy, and we had to find a meeting ground. So I obviously thought of Khilafat movement, how Indian Muslims were. And this guy was shocked. He said, what? Indian Muslims trying to protect one of the most corrupt Khalifas, you know, Abdul Majid II. And he said, I couldn't believe in my wildest dream when we were about to throw him out of power. He had got support from Indian Muslims. So he just couldn't believe what happened in India. But coming to this Khilafat movement, they never hid their intentions. They always said, as you have rightly quoted, you know, profusely quoted, that our way is the way of Sharia, our way is the way of Quran. They were very clear about it. And yet, the Congress is closing eyes to this fact, and they hope to build Hindu-Muslim unity on the basis of this Khilafat movement. Isn't it it's mind-boggling that it's not even short-sighted, much more than short-sighted. There's somebody who is clearly going out the country, is speaking both the Ali brothers and all the Khilafat leaders. So when Mahatma Gandhi started the non-cooperation movement in 1921, and he suddenly withdrew it because of the Chauri Chaura event. This is how the narrative goes, that there was one big violent event, and Gandhi was so upset that my movement is non-violent, and how come this violence spoiled so I withdraw it. That is the story being taught to the Indian student. But the much more sinister violence was going around due to Khilafat in Kerala and Maharashtra, other parts. This is completely hidden from students. Can you tell me how this situation arose and what Congress Party's attitude to these Mopla rights was?
One of the biggest lies that has been presented through our history textbooks in schools and colleges is that non-cooperation movement was part of the independence movement. It was not. Non-cooperation movement was a specific movement designed to further the goals of the Khilafat movement. And because Gandhi had risen to power, especially after the unfortunate and untimely demise of Sri Bal Gangadhar Tilak in 1920, there was literally no one in the Congress who could oppose him. So I'll give you 2 or 3 instances. At one point, there was a suggestion made during the heydays of the Khilafat movement to Gandhi that the Emir of Afghanistan could be invited to invade Bharat to dislodge the British colonizer. Before Gandhi could say anything, Madan Mohan Malviya and Lala Lajpat Rai said, if you think we are going to allow this, regardless of Gandhi, then you underestimate our understanding of history. We are not going to replace the British colonizer only to have a worser invader come back here. They made the statement abundantly clear. Now, my hunch is, had it not been for the sobering presence of Madan Mohan Malviya and Lala Lajpat Rai, I don't know what kind of concessions Mr. Gandhi would have made. His only rule was there shall be no violence. And that was the single biggest thorn in the flesh of the Khilafatists, because they said his insistence on non-violence deprives us of our ability to fulfill our Quranic obligation by way of jihad. They specifically say jihad is sanctified by and sanctioned by our holy scripture. And a Hindu who is leading this particular movement cannot tell us what we can do and what we cannot do. In multiple sessions, one of the questions that the ulama ask themselves, and even Muslim League asks itself, is why is a Hindu leading the Khilafat movement? How can it be allowed? That's a question that's even asked. Now, if you read Sri R.C. Majumdar, he will point out another fantastic instance. In Erode, which is in current day Erode district, which is right next to Coimbatore district in Tamil Nadu, these are border districts of Kerala. And there is a huge Mopla population around that period in these places. The Ali brothers traveled to Erode and they deliver a lecture where the senior Ali brother makes the categorical statement that for the purposes of achievement of the Khilafat goals, I will be comfortable opposing anyone. I will be comfortable taking support of the Afghans, and I will oppose the Hindu if he opposes the Afghan invader. He makes that statement. This is brought to Gandhi's attention with absolutely no castigation from his end. Then the British cracked down on this gentleman for making a seditious speech. And I've extracted the speech of this particular person before the Lahore court, where he clearly says, as far as we are concerned, we don't care for your laws. The only law that we abide by is divine law. I'm a Muslim first and everything else is second according to me. Sharia is the only path which is acceptable to us. Now, it is unbelievable that Gandhi was unaware of all of this. Now, Gandhi was aware of it. R.C. Majumdar and a lot of historians have suggested this very clearly, that Gandhi perhaps had become hostage to the Khilafatists at one point because he realized that he was now riding a tiger. ये शेर की सवारी बन चुकी थी उनके लिए. Okay? And had it not been for his presence, God knows what kind of violence would have been unleashed. But the fact is, even his presence did not make too much of a difference to the violence that had been unleashed. So previously, people who were moderates and who saw Gandhi as an extremist were the first ones to castigate Gandhi for the path that he had adopted, especially after the Mopla outrage in 1921 in the Malabar. So it became extremely excruciating read for me to read Annie Besant's letters to Gandhi, because the description of the atrocities was heartrending. And I had to ask myself, what prevented a peaceful coup within the Congress to dislodge Gandhi from that particular position? The fact of the matter is that this gentleman had managed to cast a spell on a lot of people thanks to his anti-Rowlatt legislation, rather pro-khilafat legislation, and the non-cooperation movement. And there was no other leader at that particular point of time. And the Muslim, let's say, leaders or the Muslims had effectively propelled Gandhi, so much so that in the annual proceedings of the Congress, they would shout down and bully others who were speaking against Gandhi. Muslim khilafatists were bullying other Congress leaders who were taking anti-Gandhi positions. That was the power of the khilafatists even in the Congress session. Imagine. So there were instances where the colleagues of Mr. Gandhi in Congress were hoping that either he would retire from politics or he would be arrested by the British. They were hoping for one of these two things. Imagine when your colleagues are asking for your political sannyas. That is the extent to which he had pushed it. So while there was a serious support from the Congress establishment to the Khilafat even before Gandhi had stepped into the picture, it is a fact that under Gandhi, the support had gone to unrestrained lengths. And it was during that particular period from 1921 to 1924 when we witnessed the maximum number of outrages and riots and Hindu genocides across the country. And that is one of the reasons that he was forced to call it off, not for any other reason. Chauri Chara was practically nothing compared to the number of genocides that had happened across the country. So he did not have the guts to launch the civil disobedience movement also, because the next round of civil disobedience was in the army. His fear was that if there is defection in the army, coupled with these genocides, what would happen to the rest of the population? So he had no other option but to call it off.
Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence of this army, disaffection?
Yes, sir. So in the book, I have actually captured some of these instances.
Mm-hmm. By the way,
sorry, please go on.
Yeah. By the way, the letter you mentioned of Annie Besant is really heartrending. And while reading that letter, I was wondering, this should have come from somebody who was Indian. This is the foreign lady raising the grassroots of what is happening to the women in Kerala. So 1 hour has very quickly passed. We hardly realized. Now my final question to you is, what next, after this book? Let me remind once again, the book, which has recently been published and authored by J Sai Deepak, is called India, Bharat and Pakistan, the Constitutional Journey of a Sandwich Civilization. So what is next, Sai Deepak?
So what was previously a tri or a trilogy has now become a tetralogy, sir. So abhi aur do pustakein baki hain. The third book will effectively cover the period from 1925 to 1946. And the final book will cover the Constant Assembly debates from 1946 to 1950. And the outline for the third book is still being put together. I have a broad framework in mind, but I will start writing it in about a month or so.
Okay, that's very interesting. And now tell me, this is my, though I was taught my teachers in general never say final question, otherwise you'll have to say final question, but this is certainly the final question. What are we afraid of? Why this knowledge? Why this new information that a lot of people like you and your colleagues unearth? Why it is not reaching our textbooks, when our students will be able to read the real history of India?
I think that the academic establishment is still controlled by a significant number of Marxists. And somehow, or for some weird reason, the current dispensation at the center in Bharat is unable to dislodge this particular establishment, despite several credible people coming out with literature proving the existing curriculum completely false. I am not a historian by any stretch of imagination. I am a decent student of constitutional law and an average student of history. But when you look at works being produced by Dr. Meenakshi Jain, even till date, and Vikram Sampath, I don't think there is any dearth of talent anymore. The constant accusation of the left has been that there is no talent or there is no intellect on the non-left. That's been their arrogant statement all these years. Well, you've been completely proven wrong. Okay, you have created an ecosystem and you have created an echo chamber wherein you have chosen to become the guardians of it and the gatekeepers of it. And therefore, your entire pass-through filter has been: if you don't subscribe to my ideology, no matter how good you may be from an intellectual capability, you will never be given access to this particular system. Now that we have broken those barriers and social media has allowed us to do so, and publishing houses have no other option but to cater to this particular demand, there is practically no reason left for the government to not act on this particular momentum. The reason why the state becomes a critical player is because the state is the single biggest entity that can create a multiplier effect, which no private initiative can. Okay. And it would also signify a significant degree of endorsement of this particular worldview by the state if it were to be introduced as part of school curricula. Let it be subject to whatever evaluation mechanisms that previous, let's say, books and curriculum have been subjected to. I would say most of our works would do even better because they're supported by primary sources and with evidence. That's not the case with the leftist school of history. So I hope that the government manages to find the courage of its conviction to walk the talk on this particular subject, because the investment of the left is in young minds for the next 20, 25 years, because they know that they will not win politically currently, but should they continue to invest in young minds of the next 20, 25 years, they will have a shot at power once more. So the left plays the game of what is known as infinite war. There is no finality to it. Okay. And so they will bide their time, wait for the right moment, and find ways to come back to power through one way or the other. And therefore, if someone operates under the belief, oh, 2019 is done, 2024 is done, 2030 is done, I'm sorry, their vision goes much beyond 2030. It's important for us to have a similar longevity of vision and length of vision.
J Sai Deepak, thank you very much indeed. This is really inspirational, and I cannot thank you much more than because this is a real painstaking research that you have done. Thank you for this remarkable work.
Dhanyawad, sir.
And I hand over to Vinayji and Manuji.
Thank you, J Sai Deepak ji, Vijay Rana ji, our most valued audience, our FISI committee members. On behalf of FISI, I extend a very hearty vote of thanks to our esteemed speakers for this valuable discussion, finding and perspective. Especially a big thank you to J Sai Deepak ji for authoring this trilogy. But as you said, it's a tetralogy now, right? Based on, I think there is one more book launch. And taking us to through this or deep dive into this journey of India, Bharat, and Pakistan. I think you beautifully summarized that during the Nehruvian era, how it was that neither the goal was noble, nor the means were noble, right? And you also touched upon the constitutional journey of this sandwiched civilization, India or Bharat, right? And you also touched upon how India, which was meant to be a secular state, was turned out to be a pseudo-secular state through policy making led by Indian National Congress, and whoever tried to challenge those decisions, they were evicted from their positions. So thanks for authoring this book, and thanks for this discussion. I would also like to thank you, Vijay Rana ji, for asking these questions to Sai Deepak ji, and taking us through this journey. I mean, we kind of got the gist of the book in just like 40-45 minutes. So it was very insightful session. Also, thanks to our audience from across the world who kept engaging through their comments. And we could see on our social handles, there are comments and reviews posted. So we are going through this. Manuji is also addressing, I think she will address those comments now or in near future. So I'll say thank you everybody, namaste, and be tuned on such discussions. We will have such insightful discussions more in future, and I will request J Sai Deepak ji also to give us some time in future when there is a new book launch, so that we along with FISI can have such insightful sessions in future. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Namaste. Good evening for the rest of the evening, people who are in India, in UK and Europe, and good night.